History remembers the Columbian Exposition by its palaces, its gleaming domes, and its triumphant avenues. A city built to dazzle the senses and define a nation's destiny. It stood not merely as a fairground, but as a monument to an idea that America had arrived, ascendant and ordained, its empire of ideals clad in neoclassical architecture. But this too was a grand deception, a fool's metric, for the foundation of the exposition was not steel, not brick, nor stone, not a celebration of what was, but a powerful assertion of what ought to be. The real architecture on display was not in the buildings, but in the minds of those who walked its manicured paths. Visitors subtly guided, molding their very consciousness with a certain version of progress, of civilization, of order. White City was not simply constructed, it was conjured. It turned chaos into choreography, poverty into picturesque absence, and history into myth. It was not a fair, but a script, a cathedral not of religion, but of national faith. The power of this place did not lie in its columns or its courtrooms, but in its capacity to shape conviction, to turn myth into mandate. For what is a republic without the belief of its citizens? What is progress without the shared faith that certain futures are inevitable and others unthinkable? What is a World's Fair, if not a carefully curated sermon in the religion of modernity? For those who command belief, command the course of civilization. Let's begin. The World's Columbian Exposition of 1893 was conceived not in a vacuum of placid celebration, but as a direct and ambitious response to a period of national anxiety. The final decades closing out the 19th century in the United States were satirically dubbed the Gilded Age by Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner. It was a time of explosive economic growth and technological marvels, veiling any stark and destabilizing set of contradictions. The slogan of progress, built upon a foundation of deep social fissures, political corruption, and cultural fragmentation, old certainties began to dissolve and pressured the nation. It required a fresh, unifying story, one that needed to be conceived and executed on a scale unprecedented. A grand, immersive, and meticulously crafted narrative designed to impose order on chaos and legitimize a new industrial elite, projecting a vision of American power and destiny onto the world stage. The term Gilded Age itself suggests a thin layer of gold masking a less lustrous reality, a metaphor that aptly captures the era's duality. The United States was undergoing a seismic transformation. We were seeing a shift from local small producers into an urban industrial behemoth dominated by giant corporations. This metamorphosis was considered the Second Industrial Revolution. Powered by steel, oil, and electricity, created unprecedented fortunes for a handful of entrepreneurs, known alternately as captains of industry, or more critically, robber barons. Men like John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, and William K. Vanderbilt, building vast empires through monopolistic practices like horizontal integration. Company grows, expands, acquires smaller businesses, leading to a larger customer base, more revenue, less competition, along with vertical integration, basically strengthening a company's control over its supply chain. This concentrated immense economic power. While this industrialization fueled national wealth and technological advancement, it came at a tremendous human cost. A vastly expanded working class, including millions of new arrived immigrants, toiled for low wages in dangerous factories and mines, living in crowded, unsanitary urban residences. This chasm between the opulent few and the struggling many bred deep-seated social and political turmoil. Rural communities swelled with discontent. Farmers, burdened by falling crop prices, high interest rates, and crippling debt to railroads and banks, coalesced into the Populist Party, a powerful third-party movement that challenged the dominance of the corporate industrial order. The political landscape was further tainted by rampant corruption, which was seen as a betrayal of these Republican ideals. To many observers, the two major parties seemed to evade the era's most pressing issues, more concerned with spoils than with public welfare. Mass migration, political corruption, higher price of living, higher cost of goods, higher taxes, gaps in wealth, shrinking middle class, and large corporations acquiring vast influence and wealth. It's good these issues are not at the forefront of our society today. The nation's cities were the primary arenas for these transformations. Urban populations grew not only from rural areas, but a massive influx of new immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. Anxious native-born Americans often resorted to theories like social Darwinism, viewing these immigrants as culturally and biologically inferior, a threat to the nation's identity. The social fragmentation was mirrored in the nation's racial landscape. Jim Crow segregation of African Americans, Native American populations were confined to reservations, and their tribal sovereignty dismantled, their cultures targeted for erasure through governmental policies, a result of the final Indian Wars which concluded in the West. Understandably, this confluence of forces, industrial strife, political corruption, urban chaos, racial conflict, created a profound sense of instability. The very fabric of American society seemed to be unraveling. Yet this created a fertile environment for a project that could offer a counter-narrative. The ruling elite, feeling their control threatened by the era's unrest, needed a way to legitimize their power and the new economic order they commanded. This would require exponential exposition, a carefully constructed vision of a harmonious, orderly, and powerful nation that stood in stark contrast to the messy and conflicted reality that the Gilded Age veneer attempted to conceal. An attempt to manufacture consensus by presenting an idealized version of America, not only to the world, but more importantly, to itself. A major psychological shift in the American consciousness was compounded during this Gilded Age. The core narratives that had defined the nation for a century were fading. One of more significance was the end of the American frontier. Westward expansion had been a defining force, shaping American character. With the U.S. Census Bureau having declared the frontier closed in 1890, this foundational myth of endless space, rugged individualism, and manifest destiny, it was officially obsolete, leaving a psychological void, a vacuum of exposition, if you will. Into this void stepped a new, outward-looking ambition, driven by a capitalist economy's relentless need for new markets and raw materials, and infused with a potent ideology of cultural superiority. America stood poised to become an imperial power. European nations had spent the previous decades carving up Africa and Asia, and a growing chorus of American expansionists urged that the U.S. must join the scramble for colonies or risk being left behind. This transition from a continental republic to a global empire required branding, a new national narrative. The nation needed to see itself not just as a prosperous republic, but as a great, modern, and civilized power destined for global leadership. The Columbian Exposition was perfectly timed and conceived to articulate and popularize this very narrative, providing the cultural justification for this new political and economic project, American Empire. The conception of the world's Columbian Exposition was the inciting incident in a grand national drama, positioned as the ideal solution to the Gilded Age's identity crisis. While publicly framed as a historical commemoration, its unspoken agenda was far more ambitious: to craft and broadcast a new, authoritative vision of America for the coming century. This effort was made possible by the simultaneous rise of a national mass media, an essential engine for transforming a local event into a nationwide cultural phenomenon. The public-facing justification for the exposition was straightforward and patriotic: to hold an international fair celebrating the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's arrival in the New World. An act of Congress in 1890 officially authorized the event, setting off a fierce competition among America's leading cities to host it. New York, Washington, and St. Louis all vied for the honor, but the prize ultimately went to Chicago. Their case was presented with the ideas of practical grounds, touting the city's central location as a major railroad hub, its abundant fresh water from Lake Michigan, and its ample space for a grand construction, making it accessible to the artisan and the farmer and the shopkeeper from across the heartland. For Chicago, winning the fair was a monumental achievement of civic pride. The city was determined to prove it had risen, phoenix-like, from the ashes of the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. Hosting the World's Fair was a declaration that Chicago had become a sophisticated, world-class metropolis, a symbol of American resilience and energy. Yet it was not the millions of inhabitants from the various contending cities that vied for the honor of hosting such a grand event. The bidding war was a battle of Gilded Age titans. New York's financial elite, J.P. Morgan and Cornelius Vanderbilt, pledged an impressive $15 million to secure the fair, but Chicago's own captains of industry, men like Marshall Field, Philip Armour, and Cypress McCormick, rallied to meet the challenge. In a final dramatic push that swayed Congress, Chicago banker Lyman Gage reportedly raised several million additional dollars in a single 24-hour period, besting New York's offer and securing the fair for the Windy City. Beneath the surface of civic pride and historical commemoration lay this deeper, more strategic agenda. It was a chance to legitimize the often brutal realities of corporate capitalism by presenting a sanitized and glorious vision of its results, showcasing American industrial might not as a source of any social conflict, but as the engine of universal progress and prosperity, rebranding its backers from robber barons into, let's say, benevolent patriarchs of a modern, powerful nation. The most crucial part being the men who would finance and manage this new national exposition were the very industrialists and financiers who presided over the new corporate economy, and they saw the fair as a powerful tool to advance their interests and solidify their cultural authority. Furthermore, the fair's organizers looked to European precedents, such as the recent Paris Exposition of 1889, which had successfully used the spectacle of a World's Fair to foster national unity and pacify any class tensions or political radicalism. The proper path to social peace lay not in radical reform, but in accepting the leadership of the nation's industrial and cultural elites. It becomes clear that this was explicitly designed to project American power onto the global stage. It was an audacious bid to announce America's coming of age, demonstrating to a skeptical Europe that the United States was not just an economic powerhouse, but also a culturally mature nation, capable of achievements in art and architecture to rival the old world. So what was the essential engine behind this vehicle? Public opinion must be shaped outside of the event, beforehand, and afterwards. This would have been impossible without the transformative power of the late 19th century media revolution, the advent of the new communication technologies, and most importantly, the rise of mass circulation newspapers, illustrated magazines, and publications in general. We explored this in episode 8 with the invention of the linotype, which was considered the eighth wonder of the world, and turned the printing world on its head. For the first time, an infrastructure existed to promote, interpret, and disseminate the story of a single event to a truly national and even international audience. The fair was a media phenomenon from its very inception. The bidding war with Chicago and New York was breathlessly covered in the press, building anticipation. Once Chicago was chosen, a flood of promotional material began to shape the public's perception. Illustrated magazines like the World's Fair Puck, which was even printed on site during the exposition, offered colorful and often satirical commentary. Lavish souvenir albums, photo books, and atlases were published, presenting an idealized vision of the fair's architecture and grounds that could be taken home and shared. Newspaper reports, though sometimes critical of construction delays, largely framed the undertaking in heroic terms, a momentous national project. And remember, if they were too critical or put out pressure on this event in a negative light, it was quite literally drowned out by the flooding of printed materials being pushed out by the Department of Publicity and Promotion. This constant stream of media coverage ensured that the fair existed in the public's imagination as a grand spectacle long before its gates ever opened, developing real estate in the subconscious of potential guests before stepping foot on the grounds. Truly brilliant marketing. This dynamic reveals the world's Columbian Exposition as a remarkable prototype for what would later be understood as a media industrial complex. It represented a powerful convergence of interests. The industrial and financial capitalists who dominated the Gilded Age economy provided the money and the content, the technological marvels and the vision of progress. The political establishment provided the national sanction and patriotic pretext, and the newly formed mass media provided the indispensable megaphone, amplifying the fair's ideological message and carrying it to every corner of the nation. It was a pioneering effort in the use of privately funded, publicly sanctioned spectacle, magnified by mass media, to engineer public consent and promote a specific vision of national identity and economic order. This model for influencing the national consciousness would become a defining feature of the 20th century. This was more than a patriotic event. It was a meticulously constructed ideological text, a physical argument for a particular vision of America and its place in the world. The fairgrounds themselves, from the grand architectural plan down to the arrangement of the exhibits, were designed to communicate a specific narrative of progress, of order, of power. One of the fair's most powerful statements was its spatial organization. The grounds were divided into two distinct and contrasting zones: the formal, sacred space of the White City and the commercial, profane space of the Midway Plaisance. The heart of the White City was the Court of Honor, a vast quadrangle of monumental buildings surrounding the Grand Basin. Here, in gleaming temples of progress, were the exhibits dedicated to what the organizers considered the most advanced domains of modern life: the Manufacturers and Liberal Arts Building, the largest one in the world at the time, the Machinery Hall, the Electricity Building, and the Agricultural Building. This basin being crowned with the Statue of the Republic at one end. Opposite was the dynamic Columbian fountain in front of the Administration Building, depicting Columbia in a triumphal barge. At night, the entire scene was brilliantly illuminated by electric lights, creating a truly breathtaking spectacle that symbolized the enlightenment, purity, and power of the American civilization. Now, a short walk away, the Midway Plaisance offered a starkly different world. The mile-long strip was the fair's amusement park, a commercialized zone of entertainment and exoticism. Here, visitors could pay to enter living exhibits. In meticulously staged ethnological villages, people from non-Western cultures were put on display. They lived in replica huts and performed daily tasks and cultural rituals for the amusement of gawking crowds. The physical journey from the Midway to the White City was designed to be an object lesson. Visitors were encouraged to see the exotic and primitive peoples of the Midway as living representatives of earlier, less developed stages of human history. After experiencing this chaotic world of the other, they would emerge into the pristine, orderly, and technologically advanced White City, the clear apex of civilization. This carefully constructed dichotomy was, in essence, a rehearsal for empire. Imperialism requires not only military and economic might, but also a cultural ideology that justifies domination, a belief in the superiority of one's own civilization and the backwardsness of others. The exposition provided a mass-scale, immersive education in this worldview. It brought the world to Chicago, but did so with a controlled framework that reinforced American superiority at every turn, by presenting other cultures as entertainment, as commodities, or just objects of scientific study. The fair habituated billions of Americans to a specific gaze. It culturally prepared the public for the nation's impending role as a global imperial power. The ideological power of the fair was magnified by its unprecedented use of technology and spectacle to create this overwhelming and immersive experience. For the majority of the 27 million people who attended, many from rural America, the fair was their first encounter with electricity on a massive scale. The sight of the White City's buildings and fountains illuminated at night by thousands of incandescent bulbs and powerful spotlights was an astonishing, almost magical spectacle. This city of light was a powerful piece of propaganda, symbolizing not only technological prowess, but also enlightenment, purity, and the dawn of a new American century. The Electricity Building itself was a temple to this new power, showcasing futuristic wonders. By any measure of popular acclaim, the exposition was a staggering success. It achieved a primary goal of dazzling the public and instilling a sense of national pride and wonder. While millions marveled at the White City, a determined group of African American leaders worked to expose the hypocrisy at its core. Despite their fervent hopes, the use of the fair to showcase the remarkable progress in the 3 decades since emancipation they were systematically excluded from any meaningful participation. Their proposals for exhibits were rejected. They were denied positions on the governing boards, refused representation in the major exhibition halls. This exclusion was not just a slight, it was a national disgrace that laid bare the lie of American progress. In a brilliant act of protest, a quartet of activists collaborated on a pamphlet titled "The Reason Why the Colored American is Not in the World's Columbian Exposition." They raised funds to print over 10,000 copies and distributed them to international visitors at the fair, a direct challenge to the official narrative. Women achieved a more visible status, yet still had underpinnings of hierarchy. The creation of a board of lady managers in a separate women's building was hailed by many as a major step forward for women's rights. The building showcased women's achievement in art, literature, and science. However, this victory was double-edged. Was this merely a separate but equal slogan? If these achievements were truly on equal footing, would they not have been included in the main exposition buildings? The most direct and visible legacy of the exposition was architecturally. The vision of the White City, orderly, monumental, and clean, is almost universally credited with inspiring the City Beautiful movement, a major force in American urban planning in the early 20th century. Architects, planners, and civic leaders who visited the fair returned to their crowded, chaotic, and industrial cities with a new ideal. They sought to replicate the fair's aesthetic of grand boulevards, expansive parks, and stately neoclassical public buildings, believing that a beautiful urban environment could inspire civic pride and moral uplift. The fair launched the career of its chief architect, Daniel Burnham, as America's foremost city planner. His seminal 1909 plan of Chicago, a direct intellectual descendant of his work on the exposition, became a globally influential model for comprehensive urban planning. The plan's emphasis on preserving the lakefront for public use, creating a system of coalescing streets, and grouping civic buildings into monumental centers. This movement, however, carried the fair's ideology into permanent urban policy. The White City was a vision of a perfectly ordered society, free from the visible signs of poverty, labor conflict, and ethnic strife that defined real cities. The City Beautiful movement can be critically viewed as an attempt to impose this idealized order on the unruly urban landscape. The philosophy that a beautiful environment would pacify a restless populace represented a form of social control, a belief that complex social problems could be solved not through fundamental economic reform, but through the top-down application of spatial and aesthetic order, thereby reinforcing the very power structures the fair had celebrated. The exposition was immensely successful in its primary ideological project, shaping the national narrative, cementing the heroic myth of Christopher Columbus in the American public consciousness, framing him as a courageous discoverer and the progenitor of American civilization. By celebrating the 400th anniversary of his voyage as the nation's origin point, the fair's narrative effectively erased any histories before and presented a sanitized version of history that would then dominate American education. The sheer scale, its technological wonders, and its triumphant tone powerfully reinforced the idea of American exceptionalism. It presented the United States as the dynamic and rightful heir to Western civilization, a nation whose industrial might, democratic virtues, and cultural achievements destined it for leadership on the world stage. This narrative provided a potent cultural foundation for the era's growing imperial ambitions. The fair taught Americans to see the world as a hierarchy, with themselves at the top. In the end, belief is the ultimate currency. We are peering behind the historical veil at the creation of civilization's most powerful tool, a media-industrial complex, a tool of vast machinery, ultimately shape and manufacture belief. Yet there is one more piece to this puzzle, its final iteration, its unknown operation. And if we don't know what we're dealing with, we may not understand when taking the bait, hook, line, and sinker.